Hello, and welcome to Redacted 101, an informal series that I have been wanting to make where I break down different parts of my universe out of character and in a more rambly, informative format than I can easily put into an in-character video. So I figured I should start out with the most fundamental part of the entire redacted audio universe, and that is the system of magic itself. Some basics. The redacted universe of content takes place in a reality that is analogous to our own in most ways. Like, it's supposed to be taking place in roughly the real world, and magic users exist there and have for most of history, but they've kept it largely secret for any of a number of reasons. Stigma, fear of abuse of power, pressure from large-scale institutions, things like that. Humans who do not have magical powers are referred to as unempowered. Sometimes they're also just referred to as humans, especially in some of my earlier content, like from the shifters or the vampires perspective. And that's kind of colloquially shorthand for what should more accurately be called unempowered. Because empowered humans, even shifters and vampires, are still human. They're just an empowered human. As far as vampires, there are some, particularly older ones, who kind of consider themselves something separate from humanity at this point, but that's kind of just a matter of perspective on their part. Realistically, they are just a highly specialized form of empowered human. So, empowered and unempowered humans coexist, but except in special circumstances, the unempowered world does not know that magic exists. If you get high enough up politically, there is knowledge there, so that the unempowered and magical governments can coexist and operate with one another in some ways, but that's a very high up, need to know basis kind of thing. On like a personal level, if you are an unempowered family member or, a very close friend, relationship partner to someone who is empowered and certain conditions are met, you can be told about magic, and you can get a distinction called informed unempowered status, where even though you are unempowered, you are allowed to know about the empowered world and about magic. But the general population has no idea that magic is a thing by design, and the magical government, which is referred to as the department, enforces that policy of secrecy, which they call covert, through illusion magic, as a preventative measure, and to keep unempowered people out of certain areas, or to make sure that unempowered people see something as being perfectly unmagical, even if it is. And then where those preventative efforts fail, they use memory modification to maintain that covert status. I don't want to get too far into the mechanics or the politics of that, though. That would be a separate, potentially upcoming video. This one is supposed to be about just the system of magic, if I can stay on topic well enough. So, to talk about how magic works, it's good to talk about how it came to be. Humanity, Earth, our reality, is one universe, takes place in one universe. Demons often call it elegy. Some humans call it terra. And that's the reality that we all know and are familiar with. That's the real world, quote unquote, for lack of a better term. There is a parallel universe to this one within, the bounds of the fiction, called Aria. Aria is basically the font of all magic in the Redacted universe. It is made up of it. It is where it comes from. Nobody knows exactly how long Aria has existed or how it came to be. There are theories, but from most people's perspectives, it just is. It's there, and it is fundamentally very different from our universe. The laws of physics and matter aren't the same. It is made up of just different building blocks. It is an inherently non-physical, non-corporeal realm. Aria is made up of what is called arcana, which is basically quote-unquote pure magic. Arcana is a raw, powerful energy that is infinitely transmutable into all these different forms, all these different forces, every kind of magical discipline that exists. But Arcana is also completely incompatible with tangible matter. When Arcana comes into contact with any facet of our universe, it unravels it at a subatomic level, just eviscerating anything physical. So, humans, for example, can't visit Aria. We can't exist there. We would just cease to exist as soon as we came into contact with it. But there are humans that have magical powers. They can control magic. So how is that possible mechanically? We'll get there in a sec. Hold that thought. Historically, how did humans get control over magic? So, for as long as anyone knows, there has been a race of beings that originated in Aria, and they refer to themselves as sovereigns. Other groups have called them sky gods, weavers, creators, etc. But for the sake of this, I'll be calling them sovereigns. So the sovereigns are beings that are made up of arcana and are incredibly powerful, and they each embody a particular breadth of the magical spectrum. For example, the Deridon gravitic sovereign is an embodiment of graviton magic, taking cohesive but still non-corporeal form. Roxit embodied broad spectrum, unspecialized magical force, what they referred to as inchoate magic, because it was magic that was at an undifferentiated state. Talrese is fire magic. Azeron is desire magic. And Delix is dream magic, so on and so forth. So in the distant past, Arya is full of these sovereigns, and they decide to try to create new life. And in doing so, they form the demons, D-A-E-M-O-N-S, as a new race of small form, limited embodiments of arcana, like the sovereigns in basic architecture, but much weaker and without any particular field of magical focus that they are tied to. Although they did tend to share certain general personality traits and temperament and demeanor, depending on the sovereign that had created them. And there's a lot more to that, but that's for a video more specifically on the sovereigns and the demons. For the sake of learning about magic, just know that there are sovereigns in Arya, and they created demons, who they then treated as basically a servant race to them, which understandably did not sit well with demonkind, who eventually rebelled. The rebellion wasn't particularly successful initially, but it was enough of an annoyance that a group of the sovereigns decided to punish the demons that were resisting by basically abandoning them and starting over somewhere else. Basically deeming them a failed experiment. And this was very bad for those demons, because they relied on their sovereigns for sustenance. So without their sovereigns, they were basically facing the threat of death by starvation of a sort. Now, this decision to abandon their demons and start over was prompted by one of the sovereigns, Roxit, having found a way to bridge the gap between Arya and this now newly discovered human realm. And so the sovereigns decided to start experimenting on humanity instead. And that involved imbuing some humans with magical powers, but only conditionally based on unending servitude, and often with horrific results to whole swaths of the human population as they experimented on them to try to craft empowered humans into a form that they found most useful. So humanity obviously had a problem with this. It was a pretty bad deal. Didn't really seem like magic was worth it. And demonkind was equally very upset at having been abandoned to wither away and die in favor of the shiny new toy. So humankind and demonkind allied together to overthrow the sovereigns. There were a few sovereigns that sided with that alliance, namely Elatum of empathy and Minara of serenity. And a war broke out, and it was a horrible affair, and it wasn't until Roxit, the most powerful of the sovereigns, joined the alliance that the tables turned. And the tables specifically turned by way of him sacrificing all of his powers at once and imbuing that unspecialized magical prowess that he possessed into a smattering of humanity. So, excuse me. So now the stage is set. We have a small but mighty portion of humanity that has received magical powers of various sorts from the sovereigns. Diderodon's experiments made the graviton energetics. Talrese's experiments made fire elementals. Endelix's made the dreamwalkers. Roxit made the freelancers, and since he gave up all of his power to do so, there are way more freelancers than any of the specialized kinds of magic users. But this huge conflict of the sovereigns had an unexpected side effect. And I swear to God, all of this is relevant. My universe is very complicated. It has grown like its own legs over the years. I apologize. But I told you all of that to tell you that that thin barrier that existed between the magical reality, Aria, and ours, Terra, was basically ripped to shreds over the course of this little war. So badly, in fact, that at any moment the delineation between them was going to collapse entirely. And if they merged, as I mentioned earlier, Arcana eviscerates physical reality when it touches it. So, if those two realities crossed over, ours would just cease to exist. So, the two remaining free sovereigns, Elatum and Minara, chose to sacrifice themselves to become a new barrier between these parallel realities. They joined together and became what's called the Meridian, a living wall between Aria and Terra to keep them connected, but shielded apart. So, we've got humans with powers. The sovereigns are all gone in different ways. One of them is dead. Two of them have become a living barrier between realities, and the rest are imprisoned in a little realm called death. But that's a story for another day. Basically, some humans have magic now. But how does that work? Arcana destroys physical stuff. It can't exist on the human plane of existence. How are humans getting this magic and having it in a form that is safe to use if the sovereigns are all basically gone? Well, there are a couple different things at play to make that happen. So, the sovereigns ultimately gifted magic abilities onto humans by binding them to what's called a core. And that's kind of like their fuel tank of magic that they can use at a given moment. It can be full, it can be empty, it slowly refills itself over time, like a well attached to an aquifer. Cores exist in a phased duality. They are in Terra and attached to a human, and they are also in Aria, bound to that magical source. And they're also not tangible in either of those places. They are out of phase with both realities as we know them, in a way that only really makes sense to the sovereigns that first laid that blueprint. Empowered humans and demons can detect the aura of magic that radiates off a person's core, but not in a particularly scientific way. It's not measurable. There's not like a sensor that can pick it up, at least not yet. It's more like a feeling. But an empowered human has a magical core that they can pull power from, that is connected back to Aria by threads that pass through the meridian in the middle. Now, humans have come to believe that their core, that wellspring of magic, somehow converts arcana into usable energy, into that safe form for them to use on our plane of existence. James mentions that in one of his videos. But humans are actually wrong in that assumption. The meridian is what actually does that conversion. That aspect of being empowered still requires a sovereign's intervention. The meridian is more than just a barrier. It's alive. It's made up of the sovereign's Elatum and Manara. And when arcana is drawn down the interdimensional threads that tie each empowered human back to the source in Aria, the meridian transforms that raw, destructive energy into a usable form of magic that then pools in the empowered human's core for them to draw on. And while nothing about that sounds basic, that is basically how humans use magic. Empowered humans are born with a core that links them to Aria, but that magic doesn't start moving down those threads and filling up their core until roughly puberty, which is when, through some sort of intra-biological process related to those puberty changes, the dormant linkage to their core activates and they get access to magic. And at that point would discover what sort of connection to magic they had, which is innate to them and it can't be changed. They could be a specialized magic user, like a particular elemental, or a shifter, or a psychokinetic, or they could be unspecialized, in which case they're a freelancer. I don't want to get too in the weeds trying to detail a genetic component to explain access to magic, because that feels like a level of detail that I am wildly unqualified to try to give any sort of believability to. But at a very high level, magical powers at this point, and at every point since the sovereign's banishment, is generally inherited from one or both parents, although there are a small but noteworthy amount of people who manifest magical powers despite having seemingly no family history of magical ability, and those people are generally referred to as human-born. The exact process that causes that is as yet unknown. I'll get into the nuances of the different branches of magic and the specialized races and that kind of thing in a future video, because that is a big list and a big topic on its own. But some other things to know about the greater system of magic as a whole would be that at this point in history, current day roughly, people have generally settled into the feeling that the different methods and practices and techniques and limitations of each field of magic have been pretty well mapped out already, which is a pretty hubristic way to look at it, but hey, we humans are really great at that. To assume we kind of know everything there is to know, and to assume that knowledge throughout history is a linear upward trajectory. However, even with that prevailing belief, there are magical historians and magical historical anthropologists that are always looking for any kinds of texts or stories or art that can shed light on how magic was used and perceived in the past. And in doing so, there have been discoveries of alternate forms of using magic. Like, contrary to the name, fire elementals don't exclusively control fire. They also have a measure of control over heat. And that comes with huge possibilities, many of which have been explored, but to act like they've all been perfectly mapped out is an inherently limiting viewpoint. But it is also one that's commonly held. And so in modern day, within the Redacted universe, there's actually been a really big problem with stagnation within the study and teaching of magic. Human control over magic has incredibly vast capabilities, but the study of that and the practice of that has become incredibly siloed over time, in part due to inherent magical specialization. So, there's a lot less interdisciplinary forms of magic than you might expect. And that's actually a big limiting factor on humanity's magic usage. People tend to stay in a particular lane and accept that that lane has been exhaustively explored already, when that's not necessarily the case. Humans are simultaneously giving themselves too much credit for having already learned everything they think there is to know, and not giving themselves enough credit for what they're actually capable of. Just because there are specialized races that represent major branches of magic doesn't mean that additional branches of magic can't exist as well. Magic that has taken on roles that exist outside of their original source of the sovereigns. One of the few examples from human history where they have discovered that and have moved past that insular way of thinking is with healing magic. There was no sovereign of healing. Healers are not a magical specialization in terms of a particular group of empowered humans' access to magic. Healers are a profession. It is an aggregate field of magic that calls on a lot of different disciplines working in tandem. And that's part of why healers are most often freelancers, because they have a natural inclination to that multi-form view of magic and its use. So there's actually a lot left for humanity to learn about magic, but the current institutional setups aren't really built to encourage that. And on some level, the larger education infrastructure and the department have subtly kind of encouraged some of those limitations in the interest of making the magical population a bit easier to govern. Also, a human's control over magic can be ended by what's called cutting their threads, which is effectively using magic to sever those interdimensional threads linking their core to Arya. It takes an extreme amount of magic to do this, one that is outside the bounds of another human's control over magic. Only demons who are, as discussed, magic given form, just on a small scale, and with a lot of limitations of their own, but only a demon is strong enough to cut someone's threads. But doing so permanently severs their connection to magic, making them an unempowered person. There also is an incredibly rare condition known as latency, in which a person who has a magical core does not get access to that core when they go through puberty, unlike everybody else. They have a core, they have magic, but they can't access it, and they don't know why. And if they were born to unempowered parents, they wouldn't even know to expect magic to manifest, so they really have no clue what's going on. Lovely, the listener character from Vincent's audios, was a latent electroenergetic, for example. It's not really known what causes latency, and it's not really known what can cure it either. The only thing that has been shown to potentially break through that latency and ignite that connection to magic is a sustained, incredibly heightened emotional state, like one might encounter in a severe trauma experience. Magic is intimately connected to emotion in a way that isn't fully understood, but is very well known. Latency can be overcome with emotion. When any empowered human is feeling very emotional, their magic can manifest itself seemingly of its own volition. Magic usage is often more powerful or more difficult to control depending on the emotional state of the user. And that connection is also exemplified in the connection between emotions and demons. Like I touched on earlier, demons are magic, given unified form. And demons previously relied on the sovereigns for their sustenance, for the energy that keeps them alive. However, when demonkind met humanity, they discovered that human emotions are also a form of energy that can sustain them. And there are certain limitations to that, but put simply, demons who are magical force given form are sustained by human emotion. And in turn, extreme outpourings of human emotion on a crowd level scale or greater can reach levels that are actually disruptive to demonkind. A big example of that was during the inversion, when Gavin was trapped in the ward and it was effectively acting as an echo chamber of this extreme amount of emotional turmoil. It reached levels that were literally causing him to lose cohesion of his physical form. He was effectively unraveling under the weight of all that emotion, and it would have eventually led to his destruction if it had gone unchecked. So, that linkage between magic and emotion is fundamental and very powerful. Magic also has a lot of allegories to music in this universe. There are a lot of musical terms that are used as titles and descriptors of magic and aria and the forces in place there. The name aria, in and of itself, the government of the demons is called the chorus. There's a concept in the universe called the spell song. And the idea behind it is that all magical beings, anyone who has tapped into the primal force of arcana in aria, is ultimately linked on some level. Every empowered human has a rhythm, an instrumentation. Their magic is a kind of song, and the notes are different, and the key is different, and their accompaniment is different, but ultimately it is one of the voices in the greater music that is magic. And demons are just as much a part of that extrapolation that is the spell song, because they are magic taking a shape. They are resonant. And that full arrangement of every empowered human and every demon together is this concept of the spell song. It was granted to all of them by the sovereigns, and the sovereigns originally controlled that orchestration. But when that rebellion, that war, that cacophony, as the demons refer to it, happened, the alliance broke the spell song from the sovereign stave and made it their own. So the spell song isn't a tangible thing, but it's an extrapolation. It's a term to describe this linkage that magic holds between all empowered humans and demons. And that connection can be felt, particularly by demons. When a human dies, their voice in the spell song goes silent. When the inversion happened and 1,500 empowered lives were lost in quick succession, that entire part of the song went quiet. and was lost. And even though the relationship between humanity and demonkind can be tense and fraught, that connection is always there. And a loss like that is deeply felt. And that connection that has existed for as long as humans have had powers is what led to demonkind calling our plane of existence elegy. Because humans die. Their voices in song go quiet. Demons call our world elegy as their lament for the mortal. The sovereigns called the groups of demons that they created and ruled over their madrigal. They took to calling their oldest creations their anacruses, the beginning of their compositions. So, across the board, there's a lot of that musical allegory in the Redacted universe. Empowered humans can also do what's called bridging. Bridging is an intimate act that you can do that temporarily binds your cores together. So, like I touched on, everyone's core has its own rhythm, its own frequency, and if two people choose to, they can temporarily synchronize those frequencies and tie them together. It is temporary and it takes a lot of focus and a lot of energy, but it takes that concept of being able to feel another magic user's aura in a vague sense and dials that up to the max. You're literally reaching out to their core and inhabiting their voice in the spell song, and the other person is inhabiting yours in the same way in that moment. So you don't just feel that the other person is magical like you could passively. You actually feel what their magic feels like to them. It is a really deep personal connection to make with someone. It is highly magical. It is highly emotional. It usually forms a brief telepathic link with the other person. It is a very intense experience, but it can be incredibly rewarding as well. Broadly speaking, magic in my universe is a kind of fundamental energy. It is a force that can be manipulated for various uses and various outputs. It's not alive, it's not sentient, it's just energy. That energy and force can be given form, it can take on a kind of sentience. That's what happened with the sovereigns and with the demons. But that's kind of like how in the real world people are a carbon-based life form, but a molecule of carbon is not a living sentient thing. It's a building block. Magic is that way too. Magical capabilities can vary to some extent from person to person beyond the scope of magical specialty, meaning, some people are stronger at magic than others in a way that goes beyond just training and is innate. People can't be made magical unless they get turned into a vampire. That's the only way that a person can gain a core, and if they already had one, they actually lose that one and gain a vampiric core. that's a little down the rabbit hole. I'll touch on that in a different video. But magic is basically something you're born with, and you can't get it or learn it. You can't get access to it, I should say, or learn it, unless you get turned into a vampire, in which case that's a very specific scenario. People engage with magic in different ways, often subconsciously, in the way that two people walking down the street are doing fundamentally the same action. They're both walking, and they're probably not thinking very consciously about that physical act, about how it's occurring, but there are actually 100 small, mostly insignificant differences in the way that they're doing it. What muscles are being more engaged, which joints are taking more of the load, their stance, their weight distribution, their balance. Magic usage is like that. It has universal shared concepts, but it is ultimately personal to you and your connection with it. Magic in my universe is an active force that has to be maintained by someone. That maintenance might only require a very small amount of their focus. Like, it can be something you're not even really having to actively think about to make happen, but magic has to be controlled by a person, be they human or demon. What I mean by that is, for example, you can't imbue an item or a location with magic. You can't make an enchanted item that you put magic in and then the magic just lives there. You have to actively maintain that magic. It can't live outside of you without your active direction. So there's no, magical amulets or something in this universe. Even magic use that seems instanced or impersonal, like a large-scale illusion that makes dam look like a government building, or a protective ward being placed around a home, or an entire stadium in the case of the elemental and energetic games. That magic is being actively maintained in the moment by someone or someones who are also close enough and have enough power in that moment to maintain them. If you lose focus, if you run out of magic, if you get too far away, if you die, the magic ends because it's coming from you. It doesn't just last out there without someone maintaining it. And that's actually part of what makes magical historians' job so difficult in my universe, because there aren't any tangible examples of magic from the past. There isn't a sword imbued with magic from the medieval times. Now, maybe there is a sword in a museum that in medieval times a fire elemental channeled their powers through that sword during combat, and so it was a flaming sword when they wanted it to be. But that magic only existed in the blade in that moment, and it ceased when they stopped putting their magic through it. And any residual echo or signature of the magic having ever been there is very short-lived in the grand scheme of things. So there are only secondary sources, like written works describing magic back then, or art depicting it, or mythologies passed down word of mouth about it. And those secondary sources are mixed in with fiction, often in a way that is impossible to discern what was true and what was a complete invention of unempowered humanity, or what was an unempowered human trying to explain magic that they saw, but without having any actual knowledge of how it worked. And all of that mixed in with the difficulty of the millennia old concept of secrecy and covert surrounding magic, having led to the destruction or preventing the creation of records from those times about magic. It's a very difficult field to study. But magic itself has been around since very ancient times, but the records aren't particularly precise. And I think that's kind of it for this video. There's a lot more specifics about different branches of magic and how they're used and classified, and how demons use magic, how they work, how the sovereigns work, all these topics that are very connected to this topic, but also big on their own. So I want to give them their own spotlight. So more on that should be coming before too long, I hope. And I hope you enjoyed this little ramble session. And as much of a ramble as it was, I hope it maybe clarified or verified some things for you. Feel free to ask more questions about it in the comments, and I can then use that to clarify more things in future installments. So I guess I'll see you then.